I've always believed that you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat old things. In a world that is obsessed with the shiny, the new, and the disposable, it takes a certain kind of soul to appreciate the quiet dignity of something that has simply survived. I am sitting here right now, in the quiet dimness of my shop, holding a soft cotton rag stained with beeswax and lemon oil. Beneath my hands is a 19th century Seth Thomas grandfather clock. The mahogany is scratched in places, bearing the unmistakable marks of generations of children running past it, of house moves, of lives lived. Most people would look at it and see kindling. I look at it and see endurance. I suppose that's why I was so blind to what was happening in my own family. I spent my whole life protecting relics from the landfill, never realizing that to my future daughter-in-law, I was just another old piece of furniture taking up valuable square footage. My name is Margaret Harrison. My friends call me Peggy. For the last 40 years, I have owned and operated Harrison's Heritage, an antique shop nestled in the heart of a historic Massachusetts town. It's a beautiful old building with creaky original hardwood floors, tin ceilings, and a large bay window that catches the amber light of the New England autumns. My husband Thomas and I bought this building when we were barely 30. We poured every ounce of our youth, our savings, and our love into it. When Thomas passed away 15 years ago from a sudden heart attack, this shop became my sanctuary. It was the only place where his voice still seemed to echo, where his careful handwriting on the old inventory tags made me feel like he was just in the back room, restoring a table leg. And then there was Arthur. Arthur is my son, my only child. When Thomas died, Arthur was barely 20, a sophomore in college. He came home standing in the middle of the shop with red-rimmed eyes, and hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would snap. "We're going to keep it going, Mom," he had whispered into my hair. "I'll help you. I promise. We won't let Dad's legacy go." And he did. For a long time, he did. Arthur practically grew up under the roll-top desks and inside the antique armoires of this shop. He knew the difference between a Queen Anne leg and a Chippendale before he knew his multiplication tables. Even after he graduated and got a job at a corporate marketing firm in Boston, he would drive down on the weekends. He'd bring me a coffee, roll up his sleeves, and help me move the heavier pieces or balance the ledger. We were a team. We were survivors. I never wanted to hold him back. I always told him, "Arthur, this is my passion, but you need to follow yours." But he would always smile that gentle, familiar smile, the one he inherited from his father, and say, "This is my home, Mom. You're my home." I believed him, because mothers are wired to believe the best in the men they raise. The shift didn't happen overnight. Tragedies in families rarely announce themselves with a trumpet blast. They creep in quietly, on designer high heels, smelling of expensive floral perfume and fake concern. Her name was Jessica. I remember the exact afternoon Arthur brought her to the shop to introduce us. It was a crisp October Saturday. The bell above the door chimed, and in walked my son, looking nervous but radiant, holding the hand of a striking, sleek woman. Jessica was 32, a real estate broker specializing in high-end commercial properties. At first glance, she was perfectly lovely. She wore a tailored white blazer that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust, sharp stilettos that clicked assertively against my worn floorboards, and a smile that belonged on a billboard. "Mom," Arthur said, his voice brimming with pride. "This is Jess." I stepped out from behind the counter, wiping the dust from my hands onto my apron, and extended a warm hand. "Jessica, it is so wonderful to finally meet you. Arthur hasn't stopped talking about you." She took my hand. Her grip was firm, calculating, and brief. "It's Jess, actually. And it's great to meet you too, Margaret. Arthur has told me so much about this place." She didn't call me Peggy. She didn't call me Mrs. Harrison. She called me Margaret, establishing a strange, immediate peer-like dynamic that made me internally flinch, though I kept my smile wide. As I offered them tea, I watched Jessica take in the shop. People who love history look at antiques with their hearts. They wonder about the hands that touched them. Real estate agents look at spaces with their calculators. I saw her eyes darting around, not at the beautiful Victorian settees or the rare depression glass, but at the load-bearing walls, the ceiling height, and the width of the street frontage out the window. "It's certainly quaint," Jessica said, sipping the Earl Grey tea I had poured her. She ran a manicured finger over the edge of a mahogany side table. She checked her fingertip for dust. There wasn't any. I keep a clean shop. She seemed almost disappointed. It's a labor of love, I replied warmly. Thomas and I built this from nothing. Every piece here has a story. I'm sure, she smiled, her eyes crinkling but remaining entirely cold. Though I have to ask, Margaret, the upkeep on a building this old must be an absolute nightmare. The property taxes on this street have skyrocketed in the last 5 years. And breathing in this musty old wood smell all day, doesn't it give you headaches? I paused, my teacup halfway to my lips. It was a masterclass in the passive-aggressive backhand. In 3 sentences, she had called my life's work a financial burden, an outdated ruin, and a health hazard. I looked at Arthur, expecting him to gently correct her, to say, "Actually, Jess, Mom loves the smell of the shop, and she owns the building outright." But Arthur was just looking at her with a love-struck, dopey expression. "Mom's a tough cookie," Arthur laughed nervously. "She manages." "Well," Jessica said, leaning into Arthur and resting her hand on his thigh, "I just worry. I see so many older folks get trapped in these massive, deteriorating properties. They become prisoners to their own nostalgia. I'd hate to see that happen to you, Margaret. You should be enjoying your golden years, not dusting. Trapped, deteriorating. Older folks, golden years." She was painting a picture of me as a frail, confused old woman clinging to a sinking ship, needing to be rescued by her modern, practical wisdom. I was only 63 at the time. I ran 3 miles every morning and managed a highly profitable niche business. But in Jessica's narrative, I was already obsolete. "I appreciate your concern, Jess," I said, my tone keeping its polite southern raised polish, though my spine stiffened. "But I assure you I am far from a prisoner. This shop is my freedom." That was the first crack in the foundation, the first warning siren that I chose to ignore because I wanted my son to be happy. Over the next 8 months, Arthur and Jess became engaged. The ring was massive, modern, and lacking any character, much like the woman wearing it. I offered Arthur his grandmother's vintage Art Deco diamond ring, a stunning piece of family history. Jess had taken one look at it, shuddered visibly, and said, "Oh, Margaret, it's sweet, but it carries so much dead energy. I really want something fresh, something that's just ours." Dead energy. That was her phrase for anything that existed before she arrived. As the wedding planning ramped up, so did Jessica's subtle campaign of isolation and manipulation. She was brilliant at it. A narcissist rarely attacks you directly. They slowly dismantle your reality under the guise of caring. She started planting seeds in Arthur's mind. He began visiting the shop less frequently on weekends. When he did come, he didn't roll up his sleeves to help. He stood in the doorway, checking his expensive new watch, looking anxious. "Mom, are you sure you shouldn't hire someone to do the heavy lifting?" he asked one afternoon, watching me easily pivot a mid-century modern credenza onto a furniture dolly. "Jess read an article about bone density in postmenopausal women. She's really worried about your hips." "My hips are fine, Arthur," I sighed, wiping my brow. "I've been moving this furniture since before you were born." I know, he said, pacing the floorboards. "But Jess is just looking out for you. She actually showed me a brochure the other day for this incredible active adult luxury condo community near Boston. No stairs, no maintenance, an indoor pool. She said you could finally relax." I stopped what I was doing and stared at my son. The boy who used to build forts under my display tables was now reciting real estate pitches from a woman who wanted to sanitize my life. "Arthur, look at me," I said gently. "Do I look like a woman who wants to live in a sterile box with an indoor pool playing bingo on Tuesdays?" He looked away, shifting his weight. "No, but Mom, look at this place. The neighborhood is gentrifying. The developers are circling. Jess says the ground underneath this shop is worth 3 times what you're making selling old teacups. She says you're sitting on a gold mine, but you're treating it like a museum." There it was, the mask slipping. It wasn't about my hips. It wasn't about my bone density. It was about the land. Jessica didn't see Harrison's heritage. She saw prime commercial real estate, zoned for mixed use. And she had convinced Arthur that my refusal to cash in was somehow an act of stubborn foolishness. "Arthur," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm, "this building is paid off. It is my livelihood, and more importantly, it is our family's history. Your father's sweat is in these floorboards. Are you really telling me you want me to sell it to some developer so they can bulldoze it and put up a trendy juice bar? It's not about bulldozing history, Mom, he snapped, a sudden flash of frustration in his eyes that I had never seen directed at me before. It's about the future. Jess and I want to start a family. I want to open my own marketing agency. We need capital. And you're holding on to a ghost, Mom. Jess is right. You're living in the past. The silence in the shop was deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo like a heartbeat. Jess is right. Those 3 words felt like a physical blow to my chest. He had chosen his side. In the eternal tug-of-war between the mother who raised him and the woman sharing his bed, I had just lost my grip on the rope. I swallowed the lump of grief rising in my throat. I refused to cry. I am a Harrison, and we do not break easily. I am not holding on to a ghost, Arthur, I said quietly, picking up my polishing rag. I am holding the fort, and as long as I am breathing, this shop stays exactly as it is. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a delivery coming. He left, the bell above the door chiming a sad, hollow sound. After that fight, the atmosphere changed. Jessica switched her tactics. If she couldn't convince me to leave willingly, she would make me feel incompetent. She began treating me not as an adversary, but as a patient. At family dinners, she would speak to me in that high-pitched, slow, syrupy voice people use for toddlers or the deeply confused. "Margaret, did you remember to take your vitamins today?" she would ask loudly across the table, ensuring everyone heard. If I misplaced my reading glasses, something I have done since I was 40, she would exchange a deeply dramatic, tragic look with Arthur. "Oh, dear," she would whisper, touching his arm. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" It was psychological warfare. She was gaslighting me in my own life, trying to build a narrative that my mind was failing. I could see the doubt creeping into Arthur's eyes. Every time I repeated a story, every time I forgot where I put my keys, I saw him mentally logging it, confirming the horrific script Jessica was writing for him. But what Jessica didn't understand about women of my generation is that we do not suffer fools, and we do not go quietly into the night. We were raised by women who survived wars and depressions. We know how to smile sweetly while we sharpen our knives. I didn't argue with her. I didn't throw tantrums. I played the part. I smiled. I let her think she was winning. Because I knew that an enemy who underestimates you is an enemy who makes mistakes. The weeks bled into months, and the wedding approached. The tension was a living, breathing thing in the room whenever the 3 of us were together. Jessica had taken complete control of the wedding planning, ensuring it was a massive, ostentatious affair that screamed new money. It was to be held at an ultra-exclusive modern country club. Every detail was curated to impress her wealthy real estate clients. I paid for the floral arrangements and the rehearsal dinner, writing checks that made my stomach churn. But I did it out of love for my son. I kept telling myself that once the wedding was over, once the stress of the planning subsided, Arthur would wake up. The fog of her manipulation would lift and my boy would come back to me. I was wrong. The fog wasn't going to lift. It was going to turn into a storm. It all came to a head on the evening of the rehearsal dinner. It was the night before the wedding. The restaurant Jessica had chosen was sleek, cold, and minimalist. All glass, chrome, and gray velvet. It looked like a very expensive spaceship. I arrived wearing a tailored emerald green silk dress that I had bought specifically for the occasion. It was elegant, appropriate for a mother of the groom, and admittedly it made me look damn good. I styled my silver hair meticulously. If I was going to sit in a room full of Jessica's pretentious, judgmental friends, I was going to do it with the grace of a queen. When I walked in, I saw Jessica at the head of the room. She was wearing a stark white avant-garde pantsuit. When her eyes landed on me, I saw a flash of genuine irritation cross her features. She didn't want me to look regal. She wanted me to look like a dusty, tired old antique dealer so she could play the benevolent, successful daughter-in-law. "Margaret," she purred, gliding over with a glass of champagne. "You made it! And look at that dress. It's so vibrant, almost theatrical." "Thank you, Jess," I smiled, taking the champagne. "It's good to see you. You look very modern." The dinner was a stiff, uncomfortable affair. I sat at the head table next to Arthur, who seemed to be sweating through his tailored suit. He kept checking his phone, looking to Jessica for cues on when to smile, when to laugh, when to eat. He looked less like a groom and more like a hostage. As the main courses were cleared away and the clinking of glasses began for the toasts, my heart swelled with a bittersweet ache. Despite everything, this was my son. Tomorrow, he would be a married man. I reached into my purse and touched the small velvet box I had brought. Inside was a pair of gold cufflinks that had belonged to his father. I was planning to give them to him after my speech, a small piece of his history to wear as he stepped into his future. Jessica's father spoke first, a loud, boisterous man who talked mostly about his own golf handicap and how much the wedding was costing him. Then it was Arthur's turn. He stood up, tapping his spoon against his crystal glass. The room fell silent. He looked handsome, so incredibly handsome, but his eyes were darting nervously. He looked at Jessica, who gave him a sharp, encouraging nod. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Arthur began, his voice slightly shaky. "Tomorrow, I marry the love of my life, the woman who has pushed me to be a better, more ambitious man. Jessica, I love you." Polite applause rippled through the room. "And," Arthur continued, his voice tightening, "tonight is special for another reason. Jess and I have been talking a lot about our future, about legacy, about moving forward." He paused, refusing to look in my direction. My stomach did a slow, terrifying drop. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "We've decided," Arthur announced, his voice echoing off the cold glass walls, "that it's time for some big changes. I'm officially leaving my firm to start my own agency, and to fund this new chapter, and to ensure my mother finally gets the peaceful retirement she so desperately needs and deserves." He finally looked at me. His eyes were pleading, begging me to just play along. "We are announcing the upcoming sale of Harrison's Heritage. The property has been appraised, and we're accepting offers from developers next month. It's the end of an era, but the beginning of an empire. To the future." He raised his glass. For 3 seconds, there was absolute, ringing silence. I didn't hear the polite clapping that followed. I didn't hear the murmurs of Jessica's friends. The blood was roaring in my ears, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of it, the cruelty. He had hijacked the rehearsal dinner, a dinner I paid for, to publicly announce the sale of my business, my home, my property, without my consent, wrapping it up in a neat little bow of helping his poor old mother. He did it in public so I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene. He did it so I would be forced to smile and nod and accept my own execution. Jessica was looking at me, a triumphant, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She had won. She had publicly backed me into a corner. But Jessica Sterling didn't know Peggy Harrison. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my glass. I slowly stood up. The emerald silk of my dress rustled in the quiet room. I picked up my glass of water, took a small, deliberate sip, and set it down. I looked directly at Arthur. "Arthur," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute, freezing authority of a mother who has had enough. "That was a lovely speech. However, there is one minor correction." Arthur swallowed hard, his face turning pale. "Mom, please, not here." "Yes, here," I replied, my tone conversational but razor sharp. "You see, everyone, my son is a wonderful marketer, but a terrible historian. Harrison's Heritage is not for sale. It will not be accepting offers from developers. Not next month, not next year, not ever." A collective gasp echoed from Jessica's family table. Jessica jumped up, her facade cracking, her voice shrill. "Margaret, you are confused. We discussed this. Your memory is failing you again. We talked about this with the doctors." "Do not insult my intelligence, Jessica," I cut her off, my voice cracking like a whip. "My memory is as sharp as a tack, and I remember perfectly well that I own the deed to that building, free and clear. My name is the only name on the title." I turned back to my son, who was trembling, his fists clenched at his sides. "If you need capital for a new business, Arthur, you will go to a bank like a man," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You will not sell your father's legacy out from under me to appease the greed of your fiancé." The room was paralyzed. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Jessica burst into tears. Real or fake, I didn't care. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing dramatically. "How can you be so cruel?" she wailed. "We are trying to help you. You're ruining my wedding," Arthur snapped. The pressure of the room, the tears of his fiancée, the public emasculation, it broke him. But instead of breaking toward the truth, he broke toward the manipulation. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face contorted in a mask of rage and humiliation. "You are a selfish, bitter old woman," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You care more about a pile of rotting wood than you do about my future. If you are going to be this toxic, if you are going to humiliate us like this, then I don't want you there tomorrow." He was breathing heavily, chest heaving. "If you won't let go of the past, Mom, then you don't get to be in my future. Don't come to the wedding." He had done it. He had pulled the trigger. The ultimate threat a child can hurl at a parent. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to fall to my knees, beg for forgiveness, and hand over the keys to the kingdom just to watch him say his vows. I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had rocked to sleep, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, the boy who had promised to protect our home. He was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing an expensive suit. I reached up to my neck. I unclasped the cheap, gaudy designer necklace Jessica had given me as a mother of the groom gift. I pulled it off and let it drop onto the white tablecloth with a heavy clatter. I picked up my purse. I didn't look at Jessica. I didn't look at Arthur. "Have a beautiful life, Arthur," I said softly, and I turned my back, walking out of the restaurant, my head held high, leaving them to the silence of their own making. The war had officially begun. I didn't go to the wedding. When the day arrived, a crisp, painfully beautiful Saturday in late October, I locked the doors of Harrison's Heritage, pulled the shades down, and went upstairs to my apartment above the shop. I sat in my armchair by the window, a cup of Earl Grey tea growing cold in my hands, and I watched the clock. At 2 p.m, I knew he was standing at the altar. At 3, I knew they were exchanging rings. At 5, they were cutting the cake. Every tick of the grandfather clock downstairs felt like a hammer against my ribs. I mourned my living son with a grief that rivaled the day I buried his father. People talk about the pain of an empty nest, but no one prepares you for the agony of a hijacked nest. I had been excised from his life like a tumor, simply because I refused to let my history be paved over for his convenience. For 4 months, there was nothing but silence. No phone calls, no text messages, not even a generic holiday card. I threw myself into my work. I sourced a beautiful collection of depression glass from an estate sale in Vermont. I meticulously restored a broken Windsor chair. I let the smell of lemon oil and old paper heal the cracks in my heart. Then, on a dreary Tuesday afternoon in February, the bell above the shop door chimed. I was at the front counter, polishing a pair of silver candlesticks. I looked up, expecting the postman. Instead, stepping out of the slush and shaking a designer umbrella was Jessica. She looked different. The sharp edges of her tailored suits were gone, replaced by a soft, oversized cashmere sweater and maternity leggings. But it was her face that caught me off guard. The arrogant, triumphant smirk was nowhere to be found. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed, and as she walked toward the counter, her lower lip actually trembled. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't throw me out." I put down the silver polish and slowly wiped my hands on my apron. I felt no anger, only a deep, icy caution. "Hello, Jess. What are you doing here?" She reached into her expensive leather tote bag, her hands visibly shaking, and pulled out a small, glossy strip of paper. She slid it across the glass counter toward me. It was a sonogram, a tiny black and white blur of a profile. A grandchild. "I'm 14 weeks along," she said, a tear perfectly timing its escape and rolling down her cheek. "It's a boy, Margaret. Arthur is going to have a son." My breath hitched. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the cruelty, a primal, undeniable wave of love washed over me at the sight of that little blurry image. It was Thomas's grandson. My grandson. Arthur doesn't know I'm here," Jessica continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He's been so depressed since the wedding, Margaret. He misses you terribly. He's too proud, too ashamed of what he said to come himself. But I couldn't bear it anymore. I don't want my son to grow up in a fractured family. I was wrong, Margaret. The wedding stress, the hormones. I pushed too hard. I'm so sorry." It was an Oscar-worthy performance. If I hadn't seen the absolute venom in her eyes at the rehearsal dinner, I would have believed her. But a woman who has spent 40 years authenticating antiques knows how to spot a forgery. You don't look at the surface. You look at the hidden joints. Her apology was too neat, her timing too perfect. She was using her unborn child as a Trojan horse. "Congratulations on the baby, Jess," I said evenly, sliding the sonogram back to her. "That is wonderful news." "Please, Margaret." She reached out, covering my hand with hers. Her skin was freezing. "Let me make it right. Let's start over. Just you and me. Let me take you to lunch tomorrow. We can talk. We can heal this." I looked at her hand resting on mine. I knew with absolute certainty that I was stepping into a trap, but if I wanted to know what kind of snare she had laid for me, I had to walk into the woods. "All right, Jess," I said, offering a tight, polite smile. "Lunch." The next day, she picked me up in her immaculate SUV, but as we drove past the restaurant district, she didn't slow down. Instead, she navigated toward a high-end medical park on the outskirts of town. "Jess, where are we going?" I asked, keeping my voice mild. "Oh, Margaret, I should have mentioned it," she said, adopting that sickly sweet, patronizing tone again. "I scheduled a little wellness check for you. I know the last few months have been incredibly stressful, and Arthur and I have just been so worried about your health. Dr. Thorne is a dear friend of a client of mine. He's a specialist. It'll just take an hour, and then we'll get a lovely lunch to celebrate." A specialist. The warning sirens in my head were deafening now. Dr. Eris Thorne's office didn't look like a medical clinic. It looked like a high-end spa. There was ambient music playing, a waterfall wall in the waiting room, and an overwhelming smell of lavender. Dr. Thorne himself was a slick man in his late 40s, wearing a tailored suit under his unbuttoned white coat, sporting a tan that definitely didn't come from the New England winter. He didn't examine my heart, my lungs, or my blood pressure. Instead, he sat me down in a plush leather chair and began asking me questions. "Margaret, Jessica tells me you've been having some trouble keeping track of things lately," he said smoothly, holding an iPad. "Losing inventory at the shop, forgetting appointments, repeating stories?" "Jessica is mistaken," I replied firmly. "I run a highly organized business." "Denial is very common," Dr. Thorne nodded sympathetically, typing something into his screen. He then proceeded to administer a series of cognitive tests. They were absurdly basic, but he delivered them with a rapid-fire intensity designed to confuse. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, while simultaneously asking me questions about my childhood. When I naturally paused to process the overlapping demands, he gave Jessica a meaningful, tragic look. After 30 minutes of this charade, he set his iPad down and folded his hands. "Margaret, I'm going to be straight with you," he said, using his best bedside voice. "Based on these preliminary assessments and the behavioral history provided by your family, you are exhibiting classic signs of mild cognitive impairment. It is highly indicative of early-stage Alzheimer's disease." I sat perfectly still. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. They were trying to medically erase my autonomy. "It's going to be okay, Margaret," Jessica sobbed, grabbing my shoulder. "Arthur and I are going to take care of you. We won't let you face this alone." "Given the stress of managing a commercial property and a business," Dr. Thorne added smoothly, "my strong medical recommendation is that you step away from your responsibilities immediately. You need a safe, controlled environment. And legally speaking, your son needs to secure a medical and financial power of attorney. To protect you, of course, before the decline accelerates." Power of attorney. There it was, the smoking gun. If Arthur got power of attorney, he could legally sell Harrison's heritage without my consent. He could drain my bank accounts. He could put me in a facility and throw away the key. And Jessica would be standing right behind him, holding the puppet strings. If I had screamed, if I had cursed at them and stormed out, I would have played right into their hands. I would have been the erratic, agitated dementia patient. So I did what a mother does when she is backed into a corner to protect her home. I acted. I let my shoulders slump. I stared blankly at the floor. I let my hands tremble slightly in my lap. "Alzheimer's?" I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "Oh, dear God. My poor mind. What am I going to do?" Jessica hugged me tightly, burying her face in my neck to hide her triumphant smile. "We'll handle the paperwork, Margaret. Don't you worry about a thing." I let her drive me home in silence. I played the part of the devastated, broken woman all the way to my front door. But the moment I heard her SUV pull away from the curb, my tears dried instantly. My posture straightened. The trembling stopped. I walked into my kitchen, picked up my phone, and called my primary care physician, a man who had known me for 20 years. I demanded an immediate referral to the neurology department at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. 2 days later, I was sitting in a stark, brightly lit examination room in one of the best hospitals in the country. I underwent a grueling 4-hour battery of tests. I had blood drawn, I had an MRI, I spoke with a neuropsychologist, and I completed cognitive exams that made Dr. Thorne's parlor tricks look like a child's puzzle. When the chief of neurology finally sat down with me, he looked genuinely puzzled. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, tapping my file, "I'm not sure who told you that you were experiencing cognitive decline, but I suggest you consider suing them for medical malpractice. Your MRI shows absolutely no amyloid plaques, no hippocampal shrinkage. Your cognitive scores are in the 98th percentile for your age bracket. Frankly, you have the neuroplasticity and recall of a healthy 40-year-old woman. You are perfectly, undeniably sane." I asked him for 3 notarized copies of the medical report. I walked out of that hospital feeling a dangerous electric clarity. Jessica wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law. She was a predator. And if she was willing to fake a medical diagnosis to steal my property, there was no telling how deep the rot went. I realized with a heavy heart that Arthur was out of his depth. He thought he was married to a woman who wanted a better future. He didn't realize he was chained to a sociopath. If I was going to war, I needed a soldier. His name was Frank Rossi. He was a retired Boston PD detective who ran a private investigation firm out of a small, messy office above a dry cleaner. He was a man of few words, a heavy smoker, and had a face that looked like it had been carved out of a catcher's mitt. I sat across from him, placed a thick envelope of cash on his desk, along with a photograph of Jessica from the wedding. "This is my daughter-in-law," I told him, my voice devoid of emotion. "She is trying to declare me mentally incompetent to steal my commercial property. I want you to follow her. I want to know who she talks to, where she goes, and most importantly, I want you to follow the money." Frank looked at the picture, then at the cash, then at me. "You want the dirt, Mrs. H?" "I want the entire graveyard, Mr. Rossi." It took him 3 weeks. 3 weeks of me playing the role of the confused, frightened mother on the phone with Arthur, who had suddenly started calling every day, gently urging me to meet with his lawyers, just to get some safety measures in place. I stalled them, citing fatigue, while Frank went to work. On a rainy Thursday evening, Frank walked into my shop. He locked the door behind him, flipped the closed sign, and dropped a thick, heavy manila folder onto the glass counter. "You were right, Mrs. H," Frank grunted, wiping the rain from his coat. "She's a piece of work. But your son isn't the mastermind here. He's the patsy." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the folder. The first thing I saw were photographs. High-quality, date-stamped images of Jessica. She wasn't at a maternity clinic. She wasn't at her real estate office. She was sitting in a dimly lit booth at an exclusive downtown steakhouse, leaning across the table and intimately kissing a man who was decidedly not my son. The man was older, with silver hair, a sharp jawline, and a tailor-made suit that cost more than a car. "That," Frank pointed a thick finger at the man, "is Richard Vance. Vance Commercial Development. He's a shark. Buys up historic blocks, gets the zoning laws changed through political kickbacks, tears them down, and builds luxury mixed-use high-rises." I felt the blood drain from my face. "They're having an affair?" "Oh, it's more than an affair, Peggy. It's a business merger," Frank said grimly. He reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of documents. "I have a buddy at the county clerk's office. He pulled some unfiled preliminary contracts. Jessica isn't trying to sell your shop to fund Arthur's marketing agency. She's brokering a backdoor deal directly with Vance." I read the highlighted text on the documents. The words blurred together, making me physically nauseous. It was a pre-signed letter of intent. Jessica had guaranteed Richard Vance the acquisition of the entire historic block, with Harrison's heritage as the anchor property. The moment Arthur legally obtained my power of attorney, Jessica was going to have him sign the deed over to an LLC controlled by Vance for a fraction of its actual market value. In exchange, Jessica was listed as the primary broker on the deal, guaranteeing her a multi-million-dollar commission. Furthermore, she had a hidden equity stake in Vance's new development project. "And Arthur?" I whispered, my voice breaking for the first time. "Does Arthur know?" Frank shook his head slowly. "Not a clue. She's playing him like a fiddle. She gets the kid to declare his mother incompetent. She forces the sale. She gets the massive payout from her boyfriend's company. And then what? My guess? Once the ink is dry, she files for divorce, takes Arthur for half of whatever he has left, and disappears with Vance. I looked down at the photograph of my pregnant daughter-in-law kissing the man who was planning to bulldoze my husband's legacy. She wasn't building a future with my son. She was using him as a demolition ball to destroy my life, fully intending to abandon him in the rubble. I closed the folder. The grief that had been weighing me down for months instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing, terrifying rage. A mother's love is a warm, nurturing thing, but a mother's wrath, when her child is being led to the slaughter, is a force of nature. Jessica thought she was dealing with a frail old woman losing her mind. She was about to find out exactly how sharp my memory really was. "Thank you, Frank," I said, my voice steady and hard as diamonds. I slid the folder into my desk drawer and locked it. "You've earned every penny." "What are you going to do, Peggy?" Frank asked, zipping up his coat. I looked around my beautiful shop. I looked at the grandfather clock that had ticked through wars and depressions. I thought of the husband who loved me and the son who had lost his way. "I am going to let them think they've won," I said quietly in the dim light. "And then I am going to burn her kingdom to the ground." They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I wasn't looking for revenge. I was performing an excavation. I was about to strip away layers of deceit, cheap varnish, and lies to expose the rotting wood underneath. I set the meeting for a Friday morning. I told Arthur on the phone, my voice perfectly pitched to a fragile, weary tremble, that I was finally ready to sign the paperwork. I told him I was just so tired, and my memory was slipping, and I needed him to take the reins. I could practically hear Jessica's triumphant sigh of relief through the receiver. I didn't open the shop that day. Instead, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, arranged a plate of biscotti on a silver platter, and sat behind my massive mahogany roll-top desk at the back of the store. I wore my favorite navy blue tailored blazer and my grandmother's pearls. I didn't dress like a victim. I dressed like a judge. Laying perfectly aligned on the desk in front of me were 3 distinct folders. My ammunition. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. They walked in like an occupying army. Arthur came first, looking pale and exhausted, holding a thick leather briefcase. Jessica followed, wearing a stunning camel-colored trench coat, her hand resting protectively over her small baby bump. And behind them was a man I didn't know, a slick, sharply dressed man in his late 30s with heavily gelled hair and a predatory, confident smile. "Good morning, Margaret," Jessica cooed, stepping forward to give me a gentle, patronizing hug. I tolerated the brief contact, smelling the expensive floral perfume that I now associated with absolute treachery. "Mom," Arthur said, his voice thick with a mixture of guilt and forced resolve. "This is Mr. Sterling. He's a senior partner at Jess's real estate firm's legal department. He's here to help us make this transition as smooth and painless as possible." "Mrs. Harrison," Mr. Sterling said, offering a hand that felt like a cold fish. "It's a pleasure. I know these situations can be emotionally taxing, but I assure you, Arthur and Jessica are acting in your absolute best interest. We just want to get you into a safe, stress-free environment." "How very kind of you all," I said, my voice smooth and placid. "Please, sit down." They pulled up 3 antique Windsor chairs and sat across from my desk. Mr. Sterling immediately opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, complete with brightly colored Sign Here tabs. "Now, Margaret," Jessica said, leaning forward with her best expression of deep, mournful sympathy. "We know the diagnosis from Dr. Thorne was a shock. We've been sick with worry, but the Alzheimer's is only going to progress. We have to secure the estate before you're no longer legally capable of doing so." "Exactly," Mr. Sterling chimed in, tapping his expensive pen against the paper. "What we have here is a comprehensive, durable power of attorney, granting Arthur full medical and financial control, as well as a quitclaim deed transferring the commercial title of Harrison's heritage into a joint trust managed by Arthur. It's standard procedure for cognitive decline cases. If you could just sign on the dotted lines, we can get this filed by noon." Arthur finally looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed. "It's for the best, Mom. You won't have to worry about a thing anymore. Jess and I are going to take care of you. We're going to put the building on the market next week, and we've already found a beautiful assisted living facility near our new apartment. You'll love it." I looked at my son. I let the silence stretch in the room. I let it stretch until the grandfather clocks ticking around us sounded like thunder. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes, the nervous way his hands wrung together. He truly believed he was doing the right thing. He believed he was saving a sick mother. "Arthur," I said softly, "do you remember when you were 12 and you broke that Ming vase in the back room? You tried to glue it back together before I noticed." Arthur blinked, caught off guard by the non sequitur. "Mom." "What?" "You used cheap superglue," I continued, my voice steady. "And you thought I wouldn't see the cracks. But a trained eye always sees the cracks, Arthur, no matter how much you try to cover them up." Jessica let out a heavy, tragic sigh and looked at the lawyer. "You see, Mr. Sterling? She's wandering. She's living in the past. Margaret, sweetie, we aren't talking about vases right now." "I am not your sweetie, Jessica," I snapped. The sudden freezing authority in my voice hit the room like a physical shock wave. Jessica flinched, her eyes widening. Mr. Sterling stopped tapping his pen. I reached forward and picked up the first folder on my desk. I slid it across the polished mahogany toward the lawyer. "Before I sign anything based on my so-called cognitive decline," I said, "I suggest you read the medical evaluation inside that folder. It is from the Chief of Neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital, dated 3 days ago. It includes a full brain MRI and a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. It states, under penalty of perjury, that I have 0 signs of dementia. My cognitive function is in the top 2% of my age group, and I am of perfect, indisputable sound mind." Mr. Sterling's confident smile vanished. He snatched up the folder, his eyes darting rapidly across the medical seals and the doctor's signature. He swallowed hard. "Mom?" Arthur breathed, confusion washing over his face. "What is this?" Dr. Thorne said. "Dr. Thorne," I interrupted, staring dead at Jessica, whose face had suddenly drained of all color, "is a fraud who accepts kickbacks from real estate developers to declare elderly property owners incompetent. A fact I have already forwarded to the state medical board." "This is outrageous!" Jessica cried, her voice pitching into a shrill panic. "Arthur, she's having a paranoid episode. This is exactly what Dr. Thorne warned us about." "Sit down and shut up, Jessica," I commanded. My voice didn't rise in volume, but the absolute fury behind it pinned her to her chair. I turned my attention to Mr. Sterling, who was now looking at the power of attorney documents as if they were covered in poison. "Now, Mr. Sterling," I said, "let's discuss the second part of your little trap. The quitclaim deed. You mentioned transferring my property into Arthur's trust. I assume you based Arthur's claim on the will of my late husband, Thomas Harrison, which stated Arthur was entitled to 50% of the business upon his 25th birthday?" "Well, yes," Mr. Sterling stammered, pulling at his silk tie. "As a legal co-owner, Arthur has the right to force a partition sale if he feels the property is being mismanaged, regardless of your medical status." "A brilliant strategy," I nodded. "If it were true. But you see, Mr. Sterling, you made a very rookie mistake. You relied on my daughter-in-law's assumptions instead of doing a thorough title search." I picked up the second folder and tossed it onto the center of the desk. "Open it," I demanded. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand and opened the file. Inside was a thick, yellowed legal document with a heavy state seal. 10 years before my husband died," I explained, looking at my son, "Thomas made a terrible investment in a warehouse district in Boston. He was facing total bankruptcy. He was going to lose the shop. He was so ashamed he couldn't bear to tell anyone. Not even you, Arthur. To save him, I used my entire inheritance from my maternal grandparents to buy out his debt and clear the liens." Arthur was staring at the paper, his mouth slightly open, the reality of the words slowly sinking in. "As a condition of that bailout," I continued, "Thomas transferred 100% of the shares of Harrison's heritage and the deed to this building solely into my name. It was finalized decades ago. You do not own 50%, Arthur. You do not own 10%. You own nothing. I am the sole absolute proprietor of this property. You have absolutely no legal standing to force a sale, to evict me, or to do anything other than walk out that door." The silence that followed was absolute. The ticking of the clocks felt like a countdown to an explosion. Mr. Sterling hastily began shoving his documents back into his briefcase. He was a shark, but he recognized when he had swum into a trap. "Mrs. Harrison, I was misinformed by my clients. I apologize for the intrusion. I will be withdrawing my counsel immediately." He didn't even look at Jessica. He practically ran out of the shop, the bell chiming wildly behind him. "Mom," Arthur whispered, tears welling in his eyes. He looked completely shattered. He had built his entire future, his marriage, his business plan, on a foundation of sand, and I had just summoned the tide. "Mom, why didn't you tell me? If I had known, I wouldn't have—" "You wouldn't have what, Arthur?" I asked, feeling a terrible, heartbreaking pity for my son. "You wouldn't have tried to declare me insane? You wouldn't have let your wife treat me like a disposable nuisance? Your character should not be dependent on my bank account." Jessica suddenly stood up. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law was gone. Her face was a mask of cold, calculating fury. "Fine," Jessica spat, her voice dripping with venom. "So you're not senile. You're just a greedy, stubborn old witch sitting on a pile of garbage. Arthur, let's go. We don't need her. We'll find investors for your agency somewhere else." "Actually, Jessica," I said, my hand resting on the third and final folder, the thick manila envelope from Frank Rossi. "We aren't quite finished, because Arthur's agency was never part of your plan, was it?" Jessica froze. For the first time since I met her, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear flash across her eyes. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Arthur asked, looking back and forth between us. I picked up the manila envelope and slid it directly to Arthur. "I hired a private investigator, Arthur," I said gently. My anger was gone, replaced by the somber duty of a mother performing a painful surgery on her child. "I needed to know why your wife was so desperate to bulldoze our family history. Open it." "Margaret, don't you dare," Jessica hissed, taking a step forward, her hands curled into fists. "Arthur, don't look at that. She's fabricating things to tear us apart." Arthur ignored her. With shaking hands, he unclasped the envelope and let the contents spill onto the desk. The high-definition photographs landed face up. Jessica and Richard Vance sitting in a dimly lit booth, their faces pressed intimately together. Jessica walking into Vance's luxury penthouse building. Jessica kissing him in the lobby. Arthur let out a sound, a choked, guttural gasp that sounded like a man who had just been stabbed in the chest. He dropped the photos as if they burned his fingers. "No," Arthur whispered, his eyes frantically scanning the images, begging them to be fake. "Jess, what is this? Who is this?" "His name is Richard Vance," I answered for her, my voice echoing in the quiet shop. "He's a commercial real estate developer, but he's not just her lover, Arthur. Keep reading." Arthur dug his hands into the pile of papers, pulling out the pre-signed contracts, the letters of intent, the hidden equity agreements. "Your wife wasn't trying to sell this building to help you start a marketing firm," I explained, watching my son's heart break in real time. "She had already pre-sold this entire block to Vance's development company in a backdoor deal. She was going to use your signature to force the sale at a fraction of the cost, pocket a multi-million-dollar commission, and take an equity stake in his new high-rise. She was using you, Arthur. You were nothing but a convenient pen to sign away my life." Arthur stood up slowly. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked at Jessica, the woman he had alienated his mother for, the woman he had fought for, the woman carrying his child. "Is it true?" he asked. His voice was dead, hollow. Jessica didn't cry. She didn't fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness. Narcissists don't feel remorse when they are caught. They only feel anger that their game was interrupted. The transformation was terrifying to watch. The soft, pregnant, worried wife evaporated. In her place stood a cold, reptilian opportunist. She looked at the photos, then looked at Arthur with an expression of absolute disgust. "Oh, grow up, Arthur," she sneered, crossing her arms over her expensive trench coat. "Did you really think I married you for your brilliant marketing mind? You make $80,000 a year and you cry during dog commercials. I married you because you were the easiest path to this property. You were so desperate for a woman out of your league that you handed me the keys to your life on a silver platter." Arthur stumbled back a step, literally staggering under the weight of her cruelty. "Jess, the baby." Jessica let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Please, Richard is 55 and has no heirs to his empire. You think I was going to strap myself to a failed middle manager and a dusty antique dealer? The baby is Richard's. It was always Richard's." The cruelty of the revelation was a physical blow. Arthur let out a choked sob and covered his face with his hands. "You are a monster," I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. Jessica turned her cold eyes on me. I'm a realist, Margaret. You won this round. Congratulations. You get to keep your rotting wood and your precious memories. You and your pathetic mommy's boy deserve each other. You can sit in this museum and turn to dust together. She calmly reached over, picked up her designer leather tote bag, and adjusted her coat. She didn't spare Arthur a second glance. She didn't look back as she walked to the front of the shop. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, mocking sound as she stepped out into the Friday sunshine, walking away to a black town car that was undoubtedly waiting to take her to Richard Vance. She was gone. The storm had passed, but the wreckage left behind was catastrophic. Arthur collapsed into the Windsor chair. He didn't just cry, he wept. He wept with the loud, ugly, uncontrollable agony of a man who has lost his wife, his unborn child, his future, and his pride all in the span of 10 minutes. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently, surrounded by the photographic evidence of his own utter foolishness. I sat behind my desk. I didn't rush to him. I didn't wrap my arms around him and tell him everything was going to be all right. Mothers are instinctively driven to shield their children from pain. But I had learned the hard way that when you shield a child from the consequences of their own weakness, you cripple them. Arthur had chosen to believe a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. He had chosen to discard me because it was easier than standing up to a manipulator. He needed to feel this pain. He needed to sit in the ashes of the life he had burned down. It was the only way he would ever learn to build something real. I let him cry. I sat in the quiet dignity of my shop, surrounded by the sturdy, unyielding relics of the past. The mahogany, the oak, the brass. Things that had survived fires and floods and time because they were built with integrity. I looked at my broken son, praying silently that underneath the ruin, he had some of that same integrity left. "I'm sorry," Arthur finally choked out, sliding out of the chair and falling to his knees on the hardwood floor. He didn't dare look up at me. "Mom, God, Mom, I am so sorry. I lost everything. I have nothing." I stood up slowly. I walked around the massive desk. I stood in front of my kneeling son. "You lost a parasite, Arthur," I said softly, looking down at him. "And you lost your ego. Those are 2 things a man is better off without." I reached out and placed a hand on his trembling shoulder. "The question now," I told him, the scent of lemon oil and old paper wrapping around us like a protective blanket, is what you intend to do with what you have left. In the movies, when a great deception is revealed, there is usually an immediate reconciliation. The prodigal son embraces the mother, tears are shed, and they sit down to a warm family dinner as if the betrayal never happened. But life is not a movie, and betrayal leaves a lingering scent that doesn't just wash out. It requires weathering. It requires time. When Arthur walked out of my shop that Friday, he was a hollow shell of a man. I watched him stumble down the cobblestone sidewalk, his expensive suit looking suddenly 2 sizes too big, the cold autumn wind whipping around him. My instinct, the fierce biological mother urge that lives in the marrow of my bones, screamed at me to run after him, to bring him back inside, wrap him in a quilt, make him a cup of hot tea, and tell him I would fix it. I could pay for a divorce lawyer. I could let him move into the apartment upstairs. I could make the bad things go away. But I stayed rooted behind my desk. I remembered watching a butterfly struggle to emerge from its chrysalis when I was a little girl. I had felt so sorry for the tiny creature fighting so hard that I used a pair of tweezers to carefully snip the cocoon open. The butterfly spilled out easily, but its wings were shriveled and weak. Because I had robbed it of the struggle, it never developed the strength to pump fluid into its wings. It never flew. It died on my windowsill. If I rescued Arthur now, if I insulated him from the consequences of his own arrogance and his willingness to sacrifice our family's legacy for a woman's approval, he would never grow his wings. He would just find another Jessica to latch onto. So I let him walk into the cold. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. The New England autumn bled into a bitter, relentless winter. The snow piled high against the bay windows of Harrison's Heritage. Inside, the shop was warm, filled with the scent of pine needles, wood smoke, and polishing wax. I worked from dawn until dusk. I kept my hands busy restoring a beautiful, battered 18th century writing desk. Every time I sanded down a rough edge or glued a splintered joint, I thought of my son. I didn't call him. He didn't call me. But I wasn't entirely in the dark. Frank Rossi, my gruff private investigator, had taken a liking to me. Every other Tuesday, he would drop by the shop, brush the snow off his heavy wool coat, and I would hand him a black coffee. He would lean against the counter and give me unofficial updates. "He's in a bad way, Peggy," Frank said one afternoon in late December, his breath pluming in the cold air as I opened the door for him. Jessica filed for divorce the Monday after she walked out of here. She drained their joint checking and savings accounts before the bank opened. Left him with nothing but the lease on that luxury apartment, which he couldn't afford. My chest tightened, but I kept my hands steady as I wiped down the counter. "Where is he living?" "He got evicted. He's renting a room in a cheap motel down in Southie by the docks," Frank sighed, taking a sip of his coffee. "He lost the job at the marketing firm, too. Turns out, he missed too many days dealing with the fallout, and his performance tanked. Right now, he's working the night shift loading boxes at a distribution warehouse just to pay off the massive credit card debt his ex-wife racked up in his name." I closed my eyes. The image of my son, who had grown up surrounded by the finest craftsmanship, who had worn custom suits, hauling cardboard boxes in the freezing dark of a warehouse, made my stomach ache. "Is he drinking?" I asked softly. "Some," Frank admitted, "but not enough to miss his shifts. He's surviving, Peggy. Barely. But he's surviving. Do you want me to slip him an envelope of cash, anonymously?" "No," I said, my voice resolute, even as my heart cracked a little more. "Thank you, Frank. But no. He has to hit the absolute bottom of the barrel. He has to feel the wood before he can push himself back up." Frank nodded respectfully, tipped an imaginary hat, and walked back out into the snow. January brought the worst blizzard Massachusetts had seen in a decade. The streets were buried under 2 feet of snow. The town shut down. The antique shop was quiet, the grandfather clocks ticking in a steady, comforting rhythm. I was sitting in the back room by the old iron radiator, drinking chamomile tea and reading a book on Victorian upholstery, when I heard a faint, hesitant knock at the front door. I checked the time. It was 8 o'clock at night. The wind was howling outside. I walked to the front, peering through the frosted glass of the door. Standing under the glow of the street lamp was a figure hunched against the wind. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. A blast of freezing air rushed in, bringing Arthur with it. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his cheeks raw and windburned. He was wearing a cheap, thin parka that was soaked through with snow, and boots that were visibly peeling at the soles. He was shivering violently, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look like an arrogant marketing executive. He didn't look like a man trying to hustle an old woman out of her property. He looked like a lost, freezing little boy. We stood in the entryway for a long time. The silence hung between us, heavier than the snow outside. "Mom," he finally croaked, his teeth chattering. I didn't know where else to go. The heat is broken at my motel. I just need to be warm for a little while. I'll leave in the morning, I promise." He wasn't asking for his inheritance. He wasn't asking for a bailout. He was just asking for shelter from the storm. I stepped back and gestured toward the back room. "Take off your wet boots. There's a blanket on the armchair by the radiator. I'll make you some soup." He nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I went up to my apartment, heated a bowl of homemade chicken stew, and brought down a pair of thick wool socks and a heavy fleece sweater that used to belong to his father. When I returned to the back room, Arthur was huddled by the radiator, wrapped in the blanket, staring blankly at the floorboards. I handed him the steaming bowl. He took it with shaking hands and ate ravenously. I sat across from him, simply watching. When he finished, he set the bowl down and let out a long, ragged breath. He finally looked up at me. "You were right, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with tears he was too exhausted to shed. "About everything. I was so stupid. I was so arrogant. I thought I was building an empire, and I was just handing the matches to an arsonist." "You made a mistake, Arthur," I said gently. "A colossal, devastating mistake. But a mistake only defines you if you refuse to learn from it." He looked around the shop, taking in the familiar smells, the shadows of the heavy furniture, the quiet history that he had once tried to sell to the highest bidder. "I lost the apartment," he said, his voice hollow. "I lost the car. The divorce is final next week. She didn't even ask for alimony because I have absolutely nothing left for her to take. The baby wasn't mine. I'm 36 years old, Mom, and I have nothing to show for my life." "You have your life, Arthur," I corrected him firmly. And you have 2 working hands, which is more than a lot of people have. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in small cuts and calluses from the warehouse work. They no longer looked like the soft, manicured hands of a corporate desk jockey. They looked like the hands of a worker. I don't want your money, Mom, he said suddenly, looking at me with a desperate sincerity. I don't want a piece of the shop. I don't want anything. I lost the right to ask you for anything the night of that rehearsal dinner. He swallowed hard, gathering his courage. But if you'll let me, if you have any odd jobs, sweeping the floors, moving furniture, hauling trash, I'll do it. Minimum wage. Whatever you think is fair. I just want to be around things that are real for a while. I want to learn how to fix things instead of throwing them away. I looked at my son. The butterfly had finally pushed its way out of the cocoon. The wings were battered and wet and bruised, but they were there. I stood up, walked over to my workbench, and opened the top drawer. I pulled out a block of raw sandpaper and a small, tarnished brass drawer pull that belonged to an antique dresser I was restoring. I walked back and placed them in his hands. You start tomorrow at 7 a.m., I told him, my voice authoritative but laced with a mother's profound relief. Don't be late. We have a lot of polishing to do. For the first time in a year, a genuine, albeit watery, smile broke across Arthur's face. I won't be late, Mom. I promise. 5 years is a funny thing. In the grand scheme of a century-old grandfather clock, 5 years is nothing but a few swings of the pendulum. But in the span of a human life, 5 years is enough time to burn a forest to ash, and just enough time for the green shoots of a new forest to break through the soil. I am 68 years old now. My hair is entirely silver, and I move a little slower on the damp mornings, but my mind remains as sharp as the edge of a chisel. Harrison's heritage is thriving. In a world increasingly dominated by mass-produced, flat-pack furniture that falls apart after 2 moves, people have begun to crave authenticity. They crave the heavy, solid weight of history. We have a waiting list of clients wanting restoration work, and the man managing that restoration workshop is my son. Arthur is 41. He wears denim aprons instead of tailored suits. His hands are permanently stained with mahogany dye and linseed oil. He is quieter now, more deliberate. The arrogant, fast-talking marketing executive died in that freezing motel room in Southie. The man who replaced him is someone his father would have been deeply proud of. We never speak of Jessica. Her name became dust in our mouths. But Karma, I have learned, is an incredibly efficient accountant. I saw her, just once, about 6 months ago. I was at a discount grocery store 2 towns over looking for a specific brand of baking flour. I turned down the canned goods aisle and practically bumped my cart into a woman in a faded, stained puffer jacket. It was Jessica. She looked 10 years older than she was. Her hair, once a sleek, expensive blonde, was brassy and pulled back in a messy clip. The arrogance that used to radiate from her like a force field was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, defensive exhaustion. A toddler, a little boy who looked remarkably like Richard Vance, was screaming in the seat of her shopping cart, demanding a box of sugary cereal. We locked eyes. I didn't need Frank Rossi to tell me what had happened. I knew the story as well as I knew the grain of oak. Richard Vance was a man who collected beautiful, ruthless things. But men like that grow bored easily. When the real estate deal for my block fell through because I refused to sell, Jessica's value to Vance plummeted. He had undoubtedly gotten her pregnant, strung her along, and then discarded her for a younger, less complicated model when the legal heat became too much. He had high-priced lawyers to shield his assets. Jessica, who had burned every bridge to get to him, was left stranded on an island of her own making. She stared at me. I saw a flash of shame, followed instantly by the defensive glare of a cornered animal. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't offer her a patronizing word of sympathy. True victory doesn't require a victory lap. I simply looked at her, acknowledged her existence, and gently maneuvered my cart around her, continuing down the aisle. She was a ghost, and I no longer let ghosts haunt me. That encounter, however, reminded me that time waits for no woman. I had protected my legacy from Jessica, but I wouldn't live forever. I needed to protect Arthur from the future, and more importantly, I needed to protect the shop from the Arthur of the past, should that shadow ever return. Yesterday, I asked Arthur to close the shop early. I told him to put on a nice shirt and meet me at the offices of my new legal team in downtown Boston. He sat nervously in the plush leather chair across from my attorney, an intimidating no-nonsense woman named Sarah. Arthur kept glancing at me, perhaps terrified that I had discovered some new failure, some new reason to cast him out. "Arthur," I began, folding my hands in my lap, "you have worked by my side for 5 years. You have shown up early, stayed late, and learned the trade. You have humbled yourself. You have earned my respect." Arthur exhaled a breath he looked like he had been holding for half a decade. "Thank you, Mom. That means everything. However," I continued, my voice firming up, "I remember the rehearsal dinner. I remember how easily you were persuaded that this family's history was nothing but rotting wood to be liquidated for cash. People change, Arthur, but human nature is frail, and money is a powerful temptation." Arthur looked down at his calloused hands. "I know. I'll never forgive myself for that." "You don't need to," I said, "because I have ensured that you will never have the opportunity to make that mistake again." I nodded to Sarah, who pushed a thick, bound legal document across the table toward Arthur. "What is this?" he asked, hesitating to touch it. "This," Sarah said smoothly, "is the Harrison Historic Preservation Trust. Margaret has finalized the paperwork this morning. Upon her passing, the deed to Harrison's heritage and the land it sits on will not go to you, Arthur." Arthur flinched slightly, but he nodded, his jaw tight. "I understand. I don't deserve it. You're leaving it to charity?" "Read it," I instructed. Arthur opened the document. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, widening as he began to comprehend the structure of the trust. "The property is being transferred into an irrevocable trust," I explained. "It can never be sold to a commercial developer. It can never be demolished. It must remain a functioning antique restoration business or a historical museum in perpetuity." Arthur looked up, stunned. "But, Mom, if it can't be sold, who owns it?" "The trust owns it," I smiled. "But the trust requires a director, someone to manage the day-to-day operations, oversee the restorations, and draw a very generous lifetime salary from the business profits. That director is you, Arthur." He stared at me, his eyes brimming with tears. "You will run the shop," I told him, leaning forward. "You will have a secure income, a beautiful place to work, and the honor of continuing your father's legacy. But you will never have the power to sell the building. You cannot mortgage it. You cannot leverage it. If you ever attempt to break this trust or liquidate the assets, you will be immediately removed as director, and the property defaults to the State Historical Society." I let the weight of the document settle in the room. "I am giving you the life, Arthur," I said softly. "I am just removing the temptation to destroy it." I waited for the anger. I waited for the prideful resentment of a son being treated like a child who couldn't be trusted with the family silver. Instead, Arthur let out a wet, genuine laugh. He closed the binder, wiped his eyes, and looked at me with an expression of profound, overwhelming relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mom, thank you for protecting me from myself." "You're welcome, my sweet boy," I replied, standing up to kiss his forehead. Later that evening, we returned to the shop. Arthur went to the back room to finish an armoire, whistling a tune his father used to hum. I stand here now, at the front window, watching the sun set over the historic district. The street lamps flicker on, casting long amber shadows across the snow. I feel the heavy brass keys to the shop resting warmly against my collarbone. To anyone listening to this, to any woman sitting in a house she built with her own blood, sweat, and tears, listening to someone tell her she is too old, too tired, or too obsolete to hold on to her power, do not believe them. They will use your love against you. They will tell you that stepping aside is the selfless thing to do. They will try to convince you that your history is a burden and that their greed is a virtue. Let them talk. Let them scheme. But never, ever hand over your keys until you are absolutely certain the hands receiving them know how to build, and not just how to bulldoze. Love your children fiercely. Love them enough to say no. Love them enough to let them fall. And love yourself enough to guard your own legacy, because nobody else is going to do it for you. I am Margaret Harrison. I am a mother, a widow, and the keeper of the clocks. And my time, I assure you, is far from over.